Actively managing your personal brand is critical if you want to make a significant impact in the areas of your life important to you. I'm Gary Brown, the Personal Brand Catalyst. I've spent most of my life working in the world of branding products. More recently, I've been exploring the world of personal branding and wrote a book on this, Brand New, Brand You. And the podcast has come out of this as a way to share first-hand experiences from some of Australia's most recognised personal brands. Ross Greenwood is the business editor of Sky News and the host of its daily program Business Now. For 17 years, he was business editor at Channel 9 and a regular on the Today Show and 9 News. He also hosted the radio program Money News across the country for 10 years. His reporting has taken him to many parts of the world. He is the former editor of BRW and Personal Investment magazines in Australia, and was the founding editor of Shares magazine in Australia and the UK. His practical experience in financial markets include being a founding director of WAM Asset Management, and for 6 years he was chairman of the investment committee at the industry fund Media Super. Ross, thank you so much for giving us your time today, and what a privilege it is to be talking to one of Australia's greatest financial commentators.
I'll tell you what, Gary, it's good to be here, and you and I know each other, of course, so that makes it a little easier, right, in this conversation.
Very true, very true. So I think really to keep with the theme of what we're talking about today is, do you see yourself as a brand?
I guess it's inevitable that you are. If you have been in the public profile for quite a long time and you realise that if you were to do something wrong behaviourally, that would destroy your brand and your reputation. Let's call it reputation. And I think that's really important to recognise. And it's about those ethical and moral decisions you make in your life. It doesn't mean you can't be sometimes tough on people who have otherwise done wrong or whatever it might be. But it just means that it's about making good decisions, sound decisions. In other words, doing things for the right reasons, not doing them for the expedient reason. And I think that's something I would have always tried to have prided myself on in the career choices that I've made. And also even in sort of the daily commentary you go about, not everything is negative. I mean, journalists, yeah, they get the reputation for carping and being negative. But I think, goodness, celebrate the good things in this country. Celebrate the great business people that we have. Yes, some will make mistakes and you've got to acknowledge mistakes. Some are crooks. You've got to acknowledge those and go really hard and try and weed them out of the system, but also acknowledge the success and the brilliance. And the one thing that I know is that in Australia, we have so many smart young people, old people, all sorts of people doing so many wonderful, innovative things that can change the world. And the barriers are coming down to those things. And so I like to try and find those stories. They're the uplifting stories. They're the things that make people feel good. And that's where you start to recognise the characteristics in others as to why they succeed. And it's often not necessarily about you as an individual. It's generally about the team you've got around you, the people who come along on the journey with you. And ultimately that might mean that you build a better business by doing that, by having others, by being a leader. I think that's the key.
I totally agree with what you're saying, and your outlook is incredibly positive. And that obviously enhances your brand, and you talk about your reputation. But then there are those who actually have a look at issues that are in a far more critical fashion.
Yeah.
And that must also have an effect on the way in which they're perceived.
Oh, there's no doubt. It's really funny. And I can remember this working in television. And there was a very well-known person I was travelling with at the time. And I saw the amount of energy they put in to be a complete and utter arsehole, right? And I was watching this. And the people around were clearly reacting negatively to this person. And I was relatively young. I would have been probably late 20s or something like that. And I looked at this and I thought, the amount of energy you are putting in to put the wrong vibe out there, when you could have taken a whole lot less energy and been pleasant to people and moved on with your day. So the thing is, If somebody wanders up and recognises you in the street, that's a nice thing. That's not a bad thing. That comes with the territory of what you're doing. But for goodness sakes, be kind of a little bit pleasant to people. It doesn't take that long. You can say, and even if you're in the middle of working your flat out, you can actually explain that to somebody. It's like, excuse me, I'm working here. So the whole thing about this is to never lose the basics of being a decent human being. If people come up and are interested in you because you've had a little bit of success, then take 2 seconds. Don't really just put up brick walls around you, because that's only going to create negative impressions to everybody else towards you. And at some stage that will come back. That hubris, as it were, will come back and will bite you on the backside.
And so do you think about the fact that of the way people perceive you?
You try not to. You try to sit there and just live your life, and some are going to like you, some are not going to like you, right? That's inevitable because of the impression that you put out there on television, for example, when you're doing that, or in business, whatever it might be. And is there much you can really do to avoid that? No, not much. So you've got to live your own life, and you've got to live with a pretty open heart, I think, is the idea about that. If you do put yourself out there in the public eye, and you've got to recognise, I must admit that now I do a lot less social media, and I certainly don't do private sort of like postings. My impression of that is my private life's my private life.
Sure.
And I try and just not keep it to myself, but I don't need to share it. No. I don't need to boast. I don't need to tell people where I'm going on holidays or where I'm eating or any of those sort of things. But, you know, sometimes professionally. But I tend to find in the social media space now that there are so many people who are anonymous, who are basically capable of attacking you, regardless of whether they know you, regardless of whether they've done the research, regardless of anything, they will attack. And you sit there and go, well, all right, but at least if I say something or do something in the media, you actually know that I've got my name on it and I've done it and I've written it and I've said it. That's it. But to attack from behind the screen where there's no anonymous, and I mean, yeah, okay, in the past we've had threats and all sorts of things happen out of that. And, you know, it's pretty cowardly, I think. But what do you do? This is the modern world. You've got to cope with it. You've got to adjust to it. And as I say, and the beauty of social media is it's enabled, it's democratised freedom of speech and opinion, all that sort of stuff. But, you know, sometimes people get a bit excited. I kind of understand that as well.
Oh, very true. And I guess that's where your personal brand, in terms of working hard to ensure that you can protect it. And when you've got this sort of anonymous or individuals targeting you for whatever reason, that's where I guess reputation can be very, very important. And using ways, and how do you use ways to try and ensure that you can protect your personal brand?
Well, it's really interesting, this. So over the years, I've set up a few businesses, small businesses, right? And I learnt fairly early the one thing you probably shouldn't do is put your name on the business. I think about Dick Smith, right? So Dick Smith basically puts his name on a business, is a highly successful business. Eventually Woolworths buys it out. His name is still on the business because his name is the brand. The brand is his name. Gets taken over, so it's still his name on that brand. So you sit there and you realise it's very hard. If your name is on the business that you create, it's hard to sell it without you. So say, for example, we had magazines in London and I was synonymous. I'd set the whole thing up. I did all the media. I was the face of the place. And what I realised after a period of time is it was actually very hard for me to extract myself. So we had an offer for the business. That's great. All the other shareholders who were there, they were all taking their money. They were all walking away. I was the one who was actually they were saying, no, you're staying. You've got to stay. You are the business. The business is you stay. And that's the interesting thing about a business. So there was a point at which eventually I thought, if this business is to survive, it's got to survive without me. And I think that's really important in any small business. If you are the entrepreneur who creates it, with your name, your brand, your energy, your skills, everything like that, then the great test of that business is whether it survives without you. Whether it survives better or worse, that's another test. But whether it survives without you is absolutely key, because you cannot sell the business in the future.
Correct.
Unless you're there. Now, you have got to be able to sell the business as a business owner and operator with that business being standalone without you. And I think for many entrepreneurs, they lose their way because they lose sight of this, because they put all of their energy, all of their passion on the side. Little aside story for you. The easiest people in the world on television to get to cry, right, are entrepreneurs who set up their own businesses, and also inventors. Right? Now, you might think this is a bit peculiar. They are so absolutely focused on their invention, on their business, on whatever. If something goes wrong, as soon as you sit there and start to get the passion going about what they're doing and all that sort of stuff, and then you ask them about what it's cost them in their lives, in their personal lives, with their families, all of a sudden the tears will come because basically these people have been so focused on that business. They're almost like alcoholics. They've lost perspective on everything else. And so the important thing about being an entrepreneur, being a small business person, being a big business person, is to never lose that perspective, to have a broader, more holistic life, and to also recognise that this business must be able to run without you if it is to be successful, if it is to be sold in the future to capitalise on the growth that you have created. I think that's one of the great lessons that I learned early in my career. And I just think it's one of those great lessons that should be learnt by young people. But the bottom line of that is be very careful about putting your name on the business.
Very sound advice, very insightful. And in fact, it runs to one of the other components, certainly that I mention in my book, about the fact your personal brand can mean different things to different people in different parts of your life. So it's important to have a breadth of exposure to the way in which you present yourselves and not have your name and your personal brand tied up with your employment, because the day you leave your employment is the day your personal brand actually could become extinct.
Well, see, there's your point. If you've put all your energies in working for a particular company and you think that company, that organisation is the pinnacle of where you're at, and that's the only thing in your life, you've got a fundamental problem. You haven't got balance.
No.
Because you've got to recognise that your skills and talents could be equally used somewhere else.
Correct.
And in some ways, it's only occasionally by testing that out that you realise not only your full potential, but also your true market worth. Nobody ever tells you how much you should be paid, for example.
No.
Right? The only way you work out how much you should be paid and how much you're worth is by testing it.
Exactly right.
And this is a funny thing about business, right? Now, you got a business. I've always had this great view, is if you set up a business, any business, doesn't matter how big or small it is, but really any offer for a business is a good offer. You never get sort of suddenly, as I say, the hubris where you suddenly say, oh, no, it's worth much more than that. No, any offer, any interest, because the offers come around often so rarely that you've got to take every one of them seriously.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Taking that further in terms of building a business, building reputation, things of that nature, when is it something that became so evident to you that reputation was everything in the way in which you have grown your life, your business, your career generally? When did that come to being? When you were young?
My great mentor, right, who probably taught me all of this, was Bob Gottliebson, Robert Gottliebson, right? Now, Bob set up Business Review Weekly. I eventually became its editor. But Bob was seriously understood that you had to market beyond your own organisation. So as young blokes, when we were in our 20s and so forth, we were out doing radio and eventually doing television, all those sorts of things, but always to promote the brand, to promote the brand back here. But he recognised, but by doing that, he understood that he was creating individual brands of the people who were there. So David Koch was there in those days along with us, you know, and you think about the brand that he ultimately created and, you know, represented for himself.
Sure.
And Bob was there. There was a number of others there as well. But the trigger at that was we had almost a fulcrum. We had the magazine, Business Review Weekly, as the thing that we were promoting. So you recognise that, yes, your personal brand was important, but that personal brand should also be represented in the values and ethics and judgment of the vehicle that you are representing. In this case, it was the magazines that we were doing in those days. And ultimately, you know, these television programs or radio programs, whatever came. But I think the great thing about that was that it really gave you a sense of having a purpose in the reasons why you were communicating. And as it turned out, we could translate things for people. And that's what we could do in those days. It was business or economics or personal finance, whatever it was. It was about being the translator. And I guess that made you a trusted ally of your consumers on the other side. So in other words, a part of what we were doing is that because we could criticise, because we could push government, because today you can, make commentary on the government and the budget and so forth, through your audience's eyes, almost as the trusted representative to put the hard questions, to raise the questions about where the budget is going, to explain the strategy, whatever it might be. That's what your role really is, even to this day.
So reputation, it comes back when you talk about the hard questions and those sort of things. It's one thing to be known to be tough on the questioning. It's another thing to be arrogant in the way in which you deliver it.
Yeah, I guess so. And as I say, it's always recognising that, frankly, there'll be one day when I won't do this. And somebody else will. And they'll be equally as trusted. They'll be very good at the job, maybe better. But that's your role.
A different brand altogether, I'm afraid.
A different brand. They'll be
you
different
have
brand.
A special brand.
Yeah, but they'll be different brands. But they may be better, they may be worse. It doesn't matter. But there will be always someone there. You are not that important in the things that you do to imagine that somebody else can't do those things. So I think that's one of the other keys. And it goes back to that heart about not putting your name on the business. Don't imagine that you are irreplaceable. Don't ever imagine that somebody else can't do your job. Of course they can.
Yeah, sure.
Because necessity means that they have to do the job.
Absolutely.
Right?
They'll just do it differently.
They'll do it differently. And it may be more successful, it might be less successful. They'll do it nonetheless.
So you mentioned that Robert Gottliebsen was a
Great
mentor.
man, right?
Wonderful person.
Yeah.
Wonderful human being.
He is.
Was he your only mentor? Was he your first mentor? Did you have mentors growing up prior to starting a career?
Well, it's funny because my father always was in business. We lived in regional country Victoria.
Yep. And
it was funny. I had a grandfather who was not the nicest bloke in the world, I would say, in hindsight. He had his moments, but he wasn't the nicest bloke. And I had a father who was, and he is, absolutely solid. And if there was ever a decision to make, I would actually first off think about what my grandfather would do, and I would do completely and utterly the opposite thing. Right?
Really?
And then I would think about what my father would do, and I would broadly do what I thought that he might do under the circumstances. So you go through there, and then the late Ian Perkin, who was the business editor at The Australian, another great business editor, was the first one. And he showed that you could actually work and have fun. Right, you could enjoy it. It was challenging. It was interesting. Then Bob going through. But there's so many others that taught you things along the way, and really, those who taught television to you, those who taught radio to you. There's always people along the way who really did sort of take the time to just explain things, to take you through things, and even colleagues who sat alongside you and you'd learn together. And that was pretty cool too. So any number of people, and even in the business community, look, there were so many people who just gave up their time. And so there were good mates of mine, the former director of Bankers Trust, Terry Power, was a great mentor, right? Because, they would teach you. And in that financial services space, Jeff Wilson, Wilson Asset Management, I was on his original board, and I've sort of been the chair of the investment committee at Media Super. So things like that, they again taught you. So it's always about trying to expand your mind a bit and really push yourself to your limits to figure out what you can do. I think that's really important.
And allow you to make the mistakes without necessarily falling flat on your face.
That's right. I think that's the case. But I think you've got to take it as a journey.
Absolutely.
And you've got to really have adventures along the way. Great thing about being a journalist is you have adventures. It tests your calmness. I think that's the one thing about business people. You've got to be passionate about what you do, but you've got to be very calm about your decision making.
Yeah.
So we often say in radio and television, it's not the first mistake that will hurt you. It's the first mistake and then the panic that will cause the second and the third mistake. So in other words, if you make a mistake and you panic, it will most likely create two more mistakes. And that's when there's a disaster.
Yep.
If you make one mistake and you fix it,
Yep.
even if that causes disruption,
Yep.
fix it well, and fix it and be done.
Yep.
So because the interesting thing about like radio and television is the deadlines when they're literally counting you into the second, and you've got to land on the interview or the program to the second, or you've physically got to be there, right?
Sure.
So this is where those critical moments are really important. Now, as I often say, I'm not saving lives. Yes, there is high pressure, but you are not saving lives.
No.
You know, you are commentating. And so it's a matter of staying relatively calm when you make those key decisions. And I think that's something else that business people can take away. Rather than getting angry or getting upset, it's about staying terribly calm in the situation and using your experience to try and work your way through that situation. I think that's when things go bad. When things go right, enjoy it.
Yeah.
Laugh, have fun.
When things are going right, that's when everything is absolutely fine. And, you know, on that sort of path, when we talk about values, everything goes so well when values align.
Yeah.
And when people are culturally aligned, but values are so critically important, and yet they're so often overlooked in society.
That's right.
When is it that you became aware that values were so important to you?
Oh, really early. I mean, it would have been when we were being taught journalism, right? That there were ethics. And remember that these are not laws, these are ethics. And there's a difference.
Yeah.
Because the law is a law and people will take themselves up to the edge of the law at every stage. Ethics is about right and wrong, right? What is ethically correct?
Yeah.
If you are a journalist, you write everything yourself.
Yep.
You don't steal from somebody else. Ethically, you make certain that you protect your contacts if they tell you something that is confidential. You protect it. And you protect it for your life, right? It goes with you. You know, ethics is about making certain that you do not, under any circumstances, throw your colleagues under the bus, right? So it's basic things, right? But really important. Really important to recognise that, you know, you've got to go through this. The other little lesson is always that if you make a mistake, own up to it. But the little thing that I keep learning, and I keep seeing it even today, there's a point at which somehow along the way, bigger organisations, they blur the lines between the reputation of the organisation and doing the right thing. In other words, the reputation of the organisation is paramount to doing the right thing and owning up to your mistakes and making certain that you have the ethical compass aligned with both. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a church, a religion. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a big organisation. I see it happen so often where the reputation of the organisation becomes the premium as compared with doing the right thing. There's a couple of examples I can even think of right now about that. And it seems as though everything is done to protect the reputation and therefore the value, the money in that organisation, as compared with doing the right thing, even if it costs that organisation significant amounts. And I think that's one of the great lessons of ethics and of morals when you're running an organisation or when you're a journalist. If you do something, even if it costs you, if you lose a job, if you do anything, because you have actually done the right thing, well, so be it. At the end of the day, you've still got to, you've got to sleep with your own morals and your own ethics. And I think that's really important. And especially as you're an entrepreneur going into a business, you're going to be faced with those dilemmas all the time. But if you really in your own heart say that we will do the right thing, because remember, there's going to be a lot of people around who are going to take the shortcuts.
Absolutely.
And you might be frustrated because they do And as a result, they get an advantage over you. Stick with the long game. That's often the case, I'd say.
And have you been confronted where you've had to make a decision between your values and that of your employer or of a story?
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And at every step you sit there and, again, you go back to what do I think is the right thing to do?
Yeah.
And if the right thing to do is, well, I've had situations where I have not written stories because of the harm I know that that could have done. Now, you might sit there and go, well, why wouldn't you? But the cheap shot was not the answer. The long game and doing the right thing was the answer. So, yeah, I think that's really important to recognise that. I guess it's about living with yourself, isn't it? You've ultimately got to be able to live in your own space and not have these conflicts. You know, it's the old thing about, if you don't tell lies, you don't have to remember them. It's kind of an easier way to kind of live your life. It's a stress-free way of living your life.
In terms of in the media space or journalistic space, it is far more prevalent. We talk about fake news and all these sort of things. It must be so much more difficult to actually navigate these challenges of what are the right values, what are the right stories, what is being faked or otherwise.
Every single day. And you've got to check. And if you're at all doubtful, then you don't do it. You've got to go. Now, I've been sued, I've been to court, done all of those things over the years because we've been hard, deliberately hard. And remember that we've had situations where others will sue us to try and protect their reputation.
Yeah. Because
we are trying to basically point out that organisation is not what it claims to be. That there are practices going on there that might be either unethical or illegal.
Yep.
And so what will happen is that they ultimately, to protect that reputation, will take us to court. And, you fight that out. But the reality is that sometimes they try and scare you by suing to try and take you to court. We've got more money than you, we'll take you on. Which is the reason why, as a journalist, you've got to have an employer behind you who's prepared to back you. And if they're not prepared to back you, then in that case, it's very difficult to work for. Because we've had a situation in the past where we were sued. The business at the time was in receivership. It was the old Fairfax. And it was funny, the receiver came out and said to us at the time, a long, long time ago, and said to us, we will back you. We will indemnify you to keep writing. And so if anything goes wrong, we as the receiver will back you. Now, that was a pretty ballsy thing for the sort of the liquidator at that time, or the receiver to do at that time. And so that meant that we could keep writing, we could go to court, and ultimately that organisation, because it had morally done the wrong thing, ultimately collapsed. And to this day, I absolutely have no regret about that, because I know that organisation was pretty much rotten to the core. But they were suing us to try and prevent us writing. They thought if they sued us, they could somehow scare us off and stop us writing. Sued us personally as well as being sued as an organisation. And so, of course, that means your house is on the line.
Sure.
So you got to accept that that's a part and parcel of what happens when you're seeking to do the right thing as a journalist.
Takes a lot of courage to go down that path.
Well, it does, but it's still, the question of right and wrong.
Absolutely.
In this regard. And so if you're in the game, you've got to recognise you're there. But that's similar to businesses that need to take the legal advice, and they've got to fight their fights and defend their territory, defend their patents, to do these types of things, because you've got to protect yourself. There's no doubt about that as a business. So when you're trying to protect a personal brand and develop a personal brand, you've also got to be conscious of protecting that brand against others who will seek to harm it. And there will be those people, competitors, who will seek to harm that personal brand.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And, and that comes down to credibility, as you say, and reputation, and whether people trust you to deliver the right message.
Yeah, that's it. But it also comes down to another little thing here, is behaviour, right? Let's go to behaviour for a moment, shall we? Surely it's not that difficult to behave well, right? So I recognise that, everybody grows up, everybody makes mistakes. I get all of that. But surely there comes a point in time, this is where it goes to workplace bullying, workplace harassment, all these types of issues. my gut feel is that is all about behaviour. There is a way to behave towards people. There is a way not to behave towards people. And surely this comes down to that if you've been successful by being highly aggressive towards staff, towards competitors, whomever it might be, suppliers, is that really the way that you want to do business? That you want to, you may succeed, you may take the shortcut. But surely behaviour is one of those things, and I don't think investment banks and shareholders, I don't think they judge this as well as they should. They're increasingly starting to, and you can see more chief executives being pushed out the door because of their behaviour, their poor behaviour. Well, to me, that's good. I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think ultimately you should behave in the workplace towards your colleagues, be they senior or junior to you. You should treat them with respect. You should be able to disagree with them, right, if you need to. Yeah, these are all the things. But, you don't put up with bullies yourself. You stand up to them. And if you have to walk away from that organisation, you walk away. Or secondly, you don't do it yourself.
Absolutely. And if you match behaviours with your values and what you say, and that doesn't match what your behaviours are, then people are not going to trust you, and that's going to damage, if not ensure you don't have a personal brand that's going to be credible or reputable.
But yes, that's so true. But every one of us understands that we've all seen somebody who's been overly aggressive and dealt with people who've been overly aggressive. But as I say, it's frustrating that in this day and age, that is still a tactic that somehow works for some people.
But it's allowed to happen in the workplace, which I find, as you do, incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredulous that you have this is the way in which people manage, not lead, because that's not leadership.
No.
It's managing their patch.
Yeah, but then you sit there, I look at that, and as I say, I come in from the outside as a journalist. So we see it. We actually see it even in journalism, right? So we see this, and you recognise it. You go, I would not work for that organisation under any circumstances if you even see a hint of it. So as I say, I just think this is where to develop your own personal brand, you've got to recognise what you represent, but it's also about your behaviour. It actually your personal reputation comes down to your behaviour.
I totally agree with you, because what you say is what you should do. And if you can't do that, then very simply you have
That's
a
right.
a
Now,
bad
does that mean that
situation.
people can't be accommodated for mistakes? People make mistakes. Let's be honest about this. But the fact of the matter is, it's when you make the mistake, what you then do, that determines what your character is. I think that's the key too.
Which gets back to your values and all the other aspects we've been discussing today. When you first understood that you needed to have a much more broader perspective on your personal brand, and you talked about your career, there are other parts to your life. Some as you say, your personal life is your personal life, but there are other things you do in your life, your career, and I've had the privilege and benefit of experiencing that in non-business environment, but you've used your expertise to enhance and assist in making yourself relevant outside your career.
Yeah, it's true. And so over the time, you get wonderful experiences along the way. So you end up on various boards like the Media Super Board and the WAM Capital Board when Jeff started that up. But also, doing some work for ASIC. There'd be charity work along the way that you'll do as a necessity, right? So it's funny, charity is charity. I remember one famous person, very famous person, ringing me up and saying to me, how much are you being paid for that charity gig that you and I are speaking at tomorrow? I've got a question mark in my head, goes, what? What are you talking about? No names, no back drill. It'd be terrible. Anyway, so I go, no, it's charity. The person goes, yeah, I know it's charity, but how much are you getting paid? And I go, like nothing, because it's charity. Which part of charity are you not understanding? He goes, yeah, I'll just get him to put $5,000 in. And I'm sitting there just going, look, so you say behaviour, right?
Exactly.
So you've got to recognise that there are people in our community who need help.
They do.
And so therefore, if you can give some assistance along the way, you give it, right? And what I'm saying is you give it. So I think but that also, guess what? That expands your knowledge. It expands your ability to see things. One of the great things I think is part of the reason why I guess my career has gone as long as it has is because of those outside experiences, which means that you build trust in other people who are in highly responsible positions who then have some trust in you.
Yeah.
To be able to keep secrets, right? Yeah. Or you can keep your trap shut and you can be told something and it won't suddenly appear. And so therefore, as a result, there's trust.
Yeah.
But what it does from my perspective is it broadens my conversation. So sometimes you don't want to get the story. You just want to know what's happening. I just need to know what happened there. So therefore you understand the people who are behaving and the people who are not behaving.
Exactly.
And that as a journalist is a pretty vital bit of knowledge to have, because the next time something happens, you recognise a pattern.
Context to the whole issue.
You recognise a pattern of behaviour. One of the great things, I don't know whether you discover this, for younger viewers of this, as you get older, your ability to tell the future becomes greater. And that's simply because as you get older, you've seen things happen. You don't panic when something happens.
Yep.
And you sit there and go, I've seen this happen before. I think it plays out like this.
Anticipation, absolutely.
I think this is the way it plays out. Now, do you always get that right? Of course you don't. But it gives you the experience to say, yes, there is actually a way in which this high inflation. What happens with high inflation? Well, the way in which that happens, you know that interest rates go up. You know that causes problems. Employers eventually, replace employment. The employment rate goes up. So it sort of gives you a sense as to what comes next.
Sure.
And what triggers might be pulled and all that type of thing to work it out. So that's, I guess, the pleasure of experience.
Totally agree.
You have a view about what's going to happen in the future.
COVID's a really good example of that, when things started going pear-shaped in the very beginning.
Yes.
There's a generation who run businesses today who'd never been around for the GFC.
Yes.
And they were like deers in the headlights. They didn't know what to do. And on one of the boards I was on, I had that situation. And I said, guys, this is what you've got to do.
Yeah.
And we were very fortunate because it literally played out like the GFC.
Yeah.
Quite
and
incredible.
it isn't interesting to actually say to people when there's a crisis on, batten down the hatches.
Correct.
Right? Batten down the hatches right now. We've got to survive. We've now gone from expansion mode to survival mode. And once we get through survival mode, we'll be back to expansion mode.
Exactly right.
That's it.
Very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
No, it's good though.
It is. It makes life incredibly interesting, and I think the other thing when you're talking about broadening your perspective and looking at helping non-for-profits, I'm sure you don't mind me saying, I was so grateful when you were a keynote speaker at the Rotary International District Conference, which took place some years ago.
But things like that, you do those because guess what? Again, they're the right thing to do. Right? They're simple things to do.
Sure, and what it also does, apart from your perspective, is it broadens your network and your whole perspective on society generally.
Well, that's right. You see different aspects of it. And that's the lovely thing about being a journalist, but particularly being a television journalist, which I love about it, right? Unlike a newspaper journalist who can often spend time in the office, on the phone, doing a great job, or radio journalist, you're always in the studio.
Sure.
As a television journalist, you physically have to go and look at things.
Yep.
So by having to go out and see things and interview people, the great thing about that is the breadth of your experience. You see things that others don't. You have experiences that others don't, which is kind of a cool sort of if you like, job description. So you sit there and sometimes I don't dwell on this, but it's pretty funny when I think about the stuff I did in the Today Show, where you get set fire to because you're doing something with stunts, and you swim with sharks. You travel in a sort of in a stunt plane.
Yeah.
There's any number of things that you do. Experience. You're driving a race car. So then you're just boring. You get thrown out of a plane. So you parachute, and you're the boring finance guy. And you sit there and go, well, how does that work? So these are the experiences where you physically got to be involved.
Absolutely.
But then we go back to the very beginning of our conversation, and you go to the very clever young people that you see achieving astonishing things in Australia, right? And you realise by going and seeing them and visiting their businesses just how smart they are. I'll tell you the one little thing I'll highlight is the solar challenge that Australia has led over the years. So that has created some of the great innovations. It has been a constant producer. So Tesla now goes to University of New South Wales and other Australian universities and basically targets the engineers working on those projects, those solar cars, because they recognise that they are the future. Now, the thing is, if you think about tritium, which has won the award for the best electric vehicle charger in the world, right? Travis and Baker backs it. Now, those guys came out of the Solar Challenge. There's a company called Spe3D, which basically can take on the back of a Bushmaster, they can do 3D metal printing in the field, right?
Really?
That can replace a part. I don't know, it doesn't matter whether it's an oil rig or on a piece of weaponry or whatever it is in the field, they can actually replace a spare part with that Spe3D. Again, the Solar Challenge came out of there. You got the former boss of the Red Bull racing team now working with the University of New South Wales Solar Challenge team. So the amount of skill and brains coming out of that stuff, it's all Australian. And that's something you've got to be very proud of. And it really shows you that young people developing their own personal brands, developing businesses, but innovating and changing the world with this innovation. With distance now no longer a barrier for Australian companies, these are the great things for our nation.
Totally agree. But it takes great people like you to actually identify these things and to spend the time, the research, the understanding and the knowledge, and you do that through your journalism. Okay. What about young people starting out in journalism? Are they learning it the same way? Are they doing it differently? How is that going to be that in the future there's going to be a succession of young Ross Greenwoods coming through to identify the same opportunities?
Well, you'd hope so. A lot of them get diverted along the way because it is frustrating and it is the long game. It's not a short game. But the good ones, if they've got the skills to write, to present, to communicate, to translate, then they've got a great and a big fun career in front of them. Now, there'll be other careers where they're more highly remunerated. There's no doubt about that. But if that's your only thing, then, find yourself a different job. But the great thing is that there are good young people. But the interesting thing about it is that we go back to social media. There are so many people who now are doing it through social media and doing it very well. The traditional media that we know is dying. But it is sort of morphing at the same time. And it's the content producers still. So this is the interesting thing as being an editor. You never should be too harsh on the original writer. There are sub-editors and the sub-editor might say that person can't write, they're terrible. I always go back to the original person who got the deal or who did it. Now, the deal might not be perfect, the story might not be perfect, but they generated it in the first place. So you've got to be highly complimentary and supportive of that person who has been the generator of the idea. Because without that idea, there's nothing else. And it doesn't matter whether that's in business or in journalism. But the way in which people these days are creating media, like we're creating media here, right? This wasn't around 10 years ago.
True.
So this is a fantastic way to communicate. And yet the barriers to entry, the costs are dropping dramatically. The ability to find niche markets are out there. They're fantastic. The fact that you've got influencers who are now doing such incredible things, right? They're fantastic. So all of these means that media is being basically fragmented, but also along the way, there are people out there who are building businesses through the fragmentation because it means that these days, a young person who's living in, pick a country town, Dubbo, right, is no longer disadvantaged by the fact that they are not in a major capital city and they're not disadvantaged because they're in Australia and they're not in America or in Europe. That person in Dubbo can now access the world with their idea, with their product, with their innovation.
Sure.
And they can get it to market more easily and quickly now as compared with somebody who's living in the United States or Europe.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the world's changing. And that's where you're going to find a generation of innovators will come forward and new businesses will start to just flourish all over the place, and are right now. Now, these could be retailers, these could be engineers, these could be singer-songwriters, they could be filmmakers, they could be all sorts of people. But the fact is now distance is no longer a barrier because of the internet, because of high-speed broadband, because of the fact that people will go to regional areas and populate them now because the barriers are dropping. And I think that's one of the great keys for business into the future.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about young people coming through, do you have any young people that you mentor?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's our young team, right, coming through.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll always take, and during the course, we, through Nine and through radio and so forth, we would always take in all of the young kids, the graduates going through university. We will still pluck kids straight out of university, and we'll train them. And we do that right now, so even 12 months ago. And the reason why you do that is because you want to get the ones who are highly motivated but highly technically literate.
Yeah.
And the skills are fantastic. And what you've got to do is hone them. The interesting thing is, for journalism, the interesting thing of young people, the observation, it's funny, is they don't like to talk to people on the phone. So we have to train them to talk to people on the phone.
Oh, really?
You've got to ring the Treasurer's office and say, we need an interview. You've actually got to call. I'll send a text. No, text. Actually call. And then you hear the thing going, hi, I want to know if the Treasurer coming. I said, no, pleasantries. Hi, how's it going? It's so-and-so. I'm so-and-so. This is what I'm looking for. It's very funny. So if there is a skill broadly that I find that young journalists can learn, it is a little bit of telephone
manners.
Which is, for people who've grown up with that, it's it's basic knowledge for us. You'd think that everybody would have that, but no.
And they're the sort of things which we take for granted. And then we have to think about how to teach young people to do it properly.
It is very funny. And so I get a laugh out of that, I must admit. But for young people, it is, you've still got to trust yourself, trust your skills, back yourself. Do not believe what older people, parents, that, the old days were better. They weren't. No. These days
were different.
They're just different. These days are as good as any other day.
Absolutely.
Your skills are as good as anybody that's been before. They're probably better in many cases.
Sure.
Right? And it's just a matter of just working on it and, getting through it. I think it is always important. I think one thing that I've learned over a long period of time, the success of your career, you said it earlier on about mentors, but the success of your career, the success of your life and the stability of it is generally about the people who are around you, be they your friends or family or your work colleagues. So if you identify people with similar values to you, who are progressive, who are smart, who are going to teach you, then ultimately, generally, you'll find you'll go forward and have a pretty good trajectory as well. I think that's really important. Don't be isolated, I think, is a key in business, as a business leader, or in the workplace. That is the worst. I think, to me, that would be the worst nightmare, to be isolated.
Absolutely. Totally agree with you. So to end off, Ross, have you any advice for younger or not so young people who are really wanting to develop themselves, their personal brand, their career, life in general?
Travel. Understand your place in the world. If you travel and you suddenly work out that your skills are as relevant in another place as they are here at home, that is a powerful thing to have in your back pocket. If you know that you can compete in another country, in the United States, in Asia, in Europe and the UK, and you can succeed and you can work there, then coming back to Australia gives you enormous confidence to know you can compete here. I think also the idea is to have a go at business, to try to actually back your dreams and back your ideals. I think that's another thing as well, and do it early. The earlier you can do it, the better. It doesn't mean that it's ever too late to start, but the earlier you do it, the better. You'll learn from your mistakes.
Sure.
Try not to be disheartened. Don't blow the bank on everything if you can possibly help to avoid it. But I think also take others along with you with the journey. I think they're some of the keys that I would suggest that young people, don't lose hope. Recognise, have a longer term view, look out and see what you think the world is going to look like in 5, 10 and 15 years' time and aim for that. That's the place to aim. Don't be sitting there worried about today. Get your head up and look forward. And the further forward you can look, the more you're going to see the opportunities that will exist, because there are, the thing that always staggers me is you get many immigrants to this country who see opportunities that Australians have got right under their nose. And so therefore Australians are taking things for granted. So the idea is to look for those opportunities. And it's also one of the reasons why Australians are so successful when they go overseas, is because they see opportunities that people in those countries take for granted. So this is the reason why the travel is so important. And recognise that the geopolitics of the world mean that India as a nation is rising very rapidly. Vietnam as a nation is going to rise very rapidly. And China will always be there. But really these other countries are really the emerging nations that will have massive influence on Australia in the future. So you've got to understand those countries as important as it is understanding your own country.
Fantastic advice. Ross, thank you so much for giving us your insights, your time, your wisdom. We are just so privileged to have you, and look forward to catching up with you in the future.
Gary, how much fun was that? That was good, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star review and subscribe for more episodes. And if you'd like to learn more about developing your personal brand, please visit garybrown.com.au to get in touch or grab a copy of Brand New, Brand You.